Hey everyone, and welcome back to another industry report. So, Shawn Layden, most recently the ex-CEO of Sony Worldwide Studios, says that he would welcome a return to 12 to 15 hour long AAA games, and like many before him, he is claiming that the current model of AAA game development is unsustainable, and he makes a lot of very interesting points, things we really should be talking about. And honestly, I mean, sometimes thinking about games, just how they're made, can be a bit disheartening, and it seems like working in today's industry can be a little bit of a nightmare where crunch is the norm and employees are, well, just kind of churned through en masse. Well, if you want a much more pleasant look into game development, then I think you should watch New Game on today's sponsor, Crunchyroll. Now, that show, it is written by an ex-game dev, and it is a slice of life, basically a really nice slice of life glimpse into what developing a game can actually be like. It's really well done, borrowing from stressful moments, of course, that the author went through at work. You just get the characters running through some very real personal industry problems they've got to grow and overcome, and it's all just dressed up in a very nice, relaxing, yet engaging run. Truly, it's great, and you can watch all 24 episodes of it in high quality now with a 14-day free trial at crunchyroll.com/Bellular. Now, the episodes are professionally subbed and they are available on nearly every device. They also offer new shows available about an hour after they first air on Japanese television. Our day-to-day is not quite as lovely as New Game is, but suffice to say, we certainly do try to make it that way. So, thank you to Crunchyroll for sponsoring and supporting our mission here. And with that, let's get into the video. Let's talk about what Shawn Layden has been going through. Shawn Layden says that he would welcome a return to 12 to 15 hour long AAA games as a means to essentially combat rising development costs. And this actually does matter for you, and well, there might actually be a few pretty notable examples of this literally happening as we move into the next gen. And basically here, Shawn is arguing that the way that things are done is not sustainable. And he's basically saying that dev costs tend to be doubling when you're going into a new generation, and that we could be getting to the stage where things basically could just topple over. I suppose part of the hope there would be things like Nanite from Unreal Engine 5 could alleviate some of that, but he is making a point that generally has stood, and certainly he's in a position to actually know what's up there given his old job. Now, the example talked about in this interview with Shawn is The Last of Us, and I think this one really just makes the point so damn clearly. The first game was around 15 hours long, and it took over 3 years to make. The second game is more like 25 hours long, but it took 6 years to make. And of course, you've got to remember that years equals time, right? And time equals money. Taking an entire console generation to make one game is extremely expensive, but there's also another pretty darn big problem, and it's one that actually matters, I think, more for us as consumers. And that is that the gaming world will have moved on past some of the conventions set up during pre-production. So if you're doing pre-production, but your game only comes out 6 years later, well, some of the things that will have been a really good, groundbreaking idea during pre-production, well, they no longer will be when your game actually comes out. And as this applies to The Last of Us Part 2, well, yeah, the one thing that I think many reviews did agree on is that while the gameplay was quite smooth and refined, parts of it just felt, you know, a bit dated. And certainly that stands up to my experience as well. Moving past that, well, playtime also does not always correlate with quality. In fact, I'd often say it's kind of the opposite. Now, Shawn is clearly still talking about the sort of every second is handcrafted, super polished first-party Sonys, but I think the same thing does apply to the likes of, say, Ubisoft's absolutely massive games. And really, conflating playtime with value is generally quite a mistake, actually. I think as audience priorities shift from just killing their time on the video box to actually wanting to enjoy a tightly crafted experience, well, when you have a story that then feels padded out for length, that's something that's often frustrating to people. And not to harp on about the game ad nauseum, but The Last of Us Part 2 is also a game that I think would have been better if it had have covered the exact same story, but in a lower running time, because yes, quite a lot of it did feel a bit padded out. Now, there's also then like free-to-play games, MMOs, and procedural games
games that have near infinite playtime. And the thing is, it's sort of hard to compete on that axis against those when you're fighting with a different set of tools entirely. So why would those sort of big AAAs want to get so darn long? Now, Shawn actually brings in the comparisons with other media. Books and movies are actually things that benefit extremely from very tight editing. And that's something that I think game writers and producers could certainly learn from a little bit more. And again, if you continue with The Last of Us Part 2, I think that's an example of where if that had have came out as a movie or as a maybe even a book or a television show, I think a lot of critics would have been saying, well, this could have been better paced. And that's, of course, extremely challenging with video games because, well, they're so darn expensive to make and they take so long, like with The Last of Us Part 2's 6-year development process. Overall with that, I would just say there is an art in something lasting as long as is needed and not stringing itself out, and I think that's extremely important to consider, and especially important because if you do it well, it also can kind of save you time and money. Now, as Shawn says here, it's all about audience expectations, and the key thing to do is to let players know exactly what they are getting into. I don't think that many people complained about The Last of Us Part 1 being too short, because it was, 12 hours, and they were just satisfied with it. Now, Ubisoft have got their finger on the pulse with this one, with Yves' latest comments, that they can afford to create huge games, and that their audience want those huge games, so they're going to continue with open-world games, but that what they're going to do is create small stories within those games, so that you can have a few different 10-hour-ish adventures that are really things that stick with you, but in that expansive world. And that, of course, is something that only really works because they've got the massive sales numbers to actually recoup their costs there. Now, while what he says there is admirable, I certainly am a bit suspicious about their ability to really give you those 10-hour incredible experiences in a game that overall is absolutely humongous. I mean, certainly I will say one of the nicer things we did hear from Ubisoft is them admitting that, yeah, maybe Assassin's Creed Odyssey was a bit too big and a bit too padded. That's actually something that was mentioned going into Valhalla. Now, another and a very Sony example I'm going to bring up here is Spider-Man Miles Morales. I think this could be an extremely important game for the industry. It could be, a bit of a wedge, right? If it is a high-profile success, despite being a smaller game that is reusing assets. And you may think to yourself, what? Small game, reusing assets? Are we just getting screwed over? Well, ultimately, I would say, if that game is sort of refining the formula of the last Spider-Man game that they did, telling a more tightly paced story where, the design team can really just focus on the stuff that matters and not actually building the foundations, that could, at the end of the day, lead to a better resultant experience to customers. And also, it's something that is being priced as such. First party and AAA, I think, in not doing more titles like that, are really ignoring a part of the market by not letting their devs feel free to work on smaller projects that could actually work as great stopgaps between the largest blockbusters. And I know this sounds a bit crazy to say, but EA are already doing this with Star Wars Squadrons. Of course, that is at a lower price point. It's a more tight-in-scope game, but it's got a clear audience that it's targeting, and they just went and did it. That's the type of thing I want to see a hell of a lot more. More things like that, like, say, Hellblade as an example. Really, I think it's an interesting situation where these are expectations that are going to be shifting around over time. From the business perspective, if you think about what Shawn is saying about essentially the doubling of dev costs from generation to generation, and by the way, that would mainly be because the games are getting bigger, they're getting more detailed, and basically just doing anything requires more headcount, so you scale up your teams and it becomes more expensive. Now, that's a problem because all of this stuff is happening. The industry is obviously, as an overall sector, growing quite a bit, but you're still running with a $60 price tag for games. Now, that $60 price tag is not something that companies seem to be willing to move away from that much. So what are they essentially doing? Well, they're pushing digital so they can get a higher cut. They are oftentimes including more things like, the DLCs, the microtransactions, stuff like that, because, well, the games are actually pretty darn expensive to make. And then obviously there is the side that, they just want to make as much money as they possibly can. So in a way, is there some sort of of situation where we could actually get shorter games that are essentially better as experiences that also could be more profitable to make, right? Actually have less risk and a lower cost. That's somewhere where I think as a consumer, well, if a game can be made cheaper to produce by cutting out the parts that aren't valuable and actually focusing on how maximum value can be provided to an audience, even if that audience is a little bit smaller, I think that's basically a good thing, especially if it means overall more experiences coming out and companies having more cycles of iteration as they are able to release more games, within a period of time. As an example, what if Naughty Dog, instead of spending 6 years in The Last of Us Part 2, did The Last of Us Part 2 in 3 years and made a shorter game and, had another game to come out now? Is that not something that could actually make more sense and actually lead to, well, more profit for Sony, but perhaps actually better experiences for customers? I think what Shawn's really touching on with all this stuff is extremely interesting, something we need to consider. There's then also, price versus development cost. Shawn says that it's an anomaly that games are so solidly at their $60 price point, despite the costs varying massively over time. Games have got a lot more expensive to make, and also, and this is something people forget, inflation has happened, right? $60 in 2005 is a totally different number of money effectively than what $60 is now. $60 now is actually less in terms of, say, purchasing power. That's a bit of a weird quirk of our industry. I'm sure you're aware that when you go down to the shop, a bottle of water is a bit more expensive now than it was in 2005, right? Now, we all know that dev costs have exploded as the fidelity of games and the scope and scale of games has increased. And the industry has basically largely avoided passing on this inflation to users directly via the ticket price of games. Expensive editions, though, do exist. In-game microtransactions, I think those are two of the more direct ways that these things have been done. There's also increasing margins with digital. That's perhaps why you're beginning to see just a lot more deal making and things like that going on in the industry. And really, it's this situation where absolute mass appeal needs to be relied on to get the audience numbers that actually have these games making sense to make. And that's actually something that is pretty darn rough if you're somebody who likes more niche experiences, because, it just doesn't make that much sense to make them. Now, obviously, this doesn't just mean that games should be $80 now and that's that. A lot of the point is that basically, right now, you can, if you're in the AAA space, it feels like you can only make a game that is meant to sell for $60. Now, that's a massive limitation. And just imagine, right, if you had any other industry that had that extremely arbitrary feeling limitation going on. It could actually be that customers would be more ready to buy a expensive game if the value was there. Or perhaps there could be another situation where a $30 game or a $40 game for a AAA would make sense. And indeed, this is an experiment our industry has been running for a really long time in the indie segment, where there is flexible pricing, essentially, and customers actually making their own value determination there, instead of everything just being pegged in that segment of the market to a single $60 price. So really, I do think the AAA should try to get in this and actually think about it. Star Wars Squadrons is a fantastic example of where we could be headed here. And then hopefully Spider-Man Miles Morales has a price point that actually fits its smaller game niche and actually does prove that point. Overall, it's a pretty crazy situation, really. We're about to hit a new console generation, so now really is a time for AAA to actually reevaluate how they're approaching making games in general, instead of just putting their nose in the grindstone and praying for the best. Personally, I would rather have, say, Naughty Dog make 2 games instead of a single Last of Us Part 2 that's twice as long. And I've got to imagine that in terms of sales, that could allow for, more shots and more wins. I could actually see that being better, both for the development studio and their publisher and for customers. Now, obviously, with all of this stuff, the implementation of it is what really matters, right? So we're talking about a lot of concepts here that could be really good if they're all done right. But of course, when you're dealing with quarterly earnings-driven companies, it's pretty darn hard to be an optimist. So there you go. But I think this is an important topic to talk about, especially because Shawn Layden brought it up. Now, Shawn Layden, just think about his past. Think about the studios he has worked with. He is a guy who is going to be in a really good position to comment on issues such as this, and I think whenever somebody with that pedigree talks about stuff like this, what we should do is we should listen and we should think, because they're probably saying something that makes sense from their experience. So, there you go. That is it for today's video. What I would say is thank you for watching, and also thank you to Crunchyroll for sponsoring this video and for helping out our channel. We are building towards some really, really cool stuff in the future, doing some R&D with our formats and stuff. So hopefully in a few months we'll be able to show you that. But it's the likes of Crunchy that, in this realm where the CPMs are pretty low and it's just a little bit rough, it's the likes of all that that actually does, really help make the whole thing go. So, thank you to them, thank you to you for watching, and seriously, check out a new game. It's actually really nice. Certainly there's a lot of darkness in the world right now, and if you maybe want a bit of a break for that, you know what? A good slice of life can be a pretty darn great place to find that. So, cheers, and I will see you next time.